Hello, everyone. Today we are continuing our discussion on the qualitative research method unit that we're currently in. So last time we talked about ethnographic research and how to conduct interviews. A lot of the mechanics with regard to obtaining and accessing qualitative data. So you'll have a paper where you have to kind of go out and conduct a some quasi-ethnographic research for the class, just to get an idea of what it looks like. Today I'm going to give you an example of how and why qualitative research is useful, all right, which is different than quantitative. Quantitative is about measurements, about numbers, about sort of what exists um, with metrics, all right, with quantitative data, obviously. Qualitative research is trying to sort of figure out the deeper understanding through interviews, through focus groups. Um, there are feelings that can't be captured by numbers. We can try to capture feelings by numbers, which is why we've talked about things like operationalizing certain terms that can't be quantified, right? But there are ways in which we might want to go out and try to understand people's feelings about the world or the feelings they have about their experiences in the world. And we do that through qualitative methods, right? Through some sort of interviewing ethnographic process. So I want to just give you an example of some of the tensions here between quantitative and qualitative research. They are compatible. They're both useful. I've engaged with both of them. All right. But there are some tensions there, and they try to reconcile themselves with one another. So we're going to use an example of this. We're going to use this book called Life is a Miracle, an essay against modern superstition. It's written by this author named Wendell Berry, and we'll talk more about Berry in the upcoming slides. All right, so Wendell Berry, I'll get a little bit more into his biography near the end of this, but he wrote this book in 2001. And it was a critique of E.O. Wilson, who is this gentleman down here. This is E.O. Wilson. This is Wendell Berry. E.O. Wilson is a scientist. And what Wendell Berry is sort of, he's writing against, he's concerned, all right, so he's concerned about what he calls the genuflecting at the altar of science, right? To genuflect means to sort of bend one's knee in reverence, right? So you would genuflect before the monarchy, you would genuflect before the altar of, whatever church you're going to, right? So to genuflect in front of the altar of science means to sort of bow down in such high regard, to bend one's knee with high regard in front of, something that is infallible, right? And what Barry is concerned about is that we sort of genuflect in front of the altar of science. And when we do that, we are not carefully considering all the other ways in which life happens, right? He's concerned that we can't, just sort of reduce our lived experiences into quantifiable numbers and data and statistics, that there are other things that make up a worthwhile life, that give us meaning in life, that aren't reducible, right? So at the bottom of quantitative science, so the scientific method as put out by E.O. Wilson and others, right, is materialism, right, which is sort of like the firm foundation below us that can be quantified in numbers and data, right? However, the idea that everything can be reduced and nothing exists outside that which can be quantified, Barry says that's a problem, right? That just because we can't quantify certain experiences doesn't mean that those things aren't important or don't have relevance in our life. And we have to be careful to sort of manage that tension between bowing before the altar of science and recognizing that there are other feelings and purpose in our life that can't be quantified. All right. Well, let's get a couple examples for me. Right. All right. So he raises concerns in this book about this idea that like science will save us again in a quantifiable way. So some of the examples he gives, which I think are relevant, right? He points out, that science has created the ability to transform fossil fuels into energy, right? So the gasoline in your car, that's science created that, right? The ability to burn coal for heating and energy, science created that. And then Barry says, we're using the same processes to, now we're trusting science to fix all of these problems that science sort of created in the first place, right? So similar concerns with things like plastic, right? plastic was a scientific, invention. It was, plastic is incredible for all the things that it can do. I mean, the fact that it's cheap and it's reliable and it's airtight and it can hold liquids and that it doesn't just fall apart and degrade quickly, like that's a reason why plastic is incredible. That's also the downfall of plastic, right? You drink a Pepsi bottle, and if you throw it on the ground and you litter, like it's going to end up being in the environment long after you are. Like the durability of plastic is both its strength and its weakness, right? So Barry raises these concerns. It says we keep going back to science to solve these problems, but when science solves problems, there are ways in which it creates more problems. And if we keep putting our trust in this idea of like solving problems and then creating problems and creating more problems and solving problems, we're losing sight of, sort of like what is life for, right? And we'll talk about this a little bit more on a later slide, right? But he notes that there are many things outside of scientific explanations that we should be concerning ourselves with, right? So things like, how does this, how do these scientific discoveries, how do they create tighter communities, right? We're looking for efficiency in science, right? The sort of like life hacks that science allow us, the efficiencies that come with our smartphones, for instance, the efficiencies that come with our computers. Wendell Berry puts a lot of emphasis in his work on sort of the quality of life, not just whether or not life is efficient with regard to the data and the numbers, but he says we should be treating science as not just like, can it make life more efficient, but is it contributing to things that we actually care about, such as community? Does it make my community stronger? Does it give us a sense of belonging, right? Does it, give us relationships? Various aspects of religion that can't be quantified, right? If you have a relationship with a god of whatever religion you might partake in, like that is outside of quantifiable scientific statistics, right? The mysteries of life, right? Art, which we'll talk about more. There's a video I'm going to have you watch at the end of this, right? Art and the feelings that it brings, right? So if you see a beautiful piece of art and you sort of stand in awe of it for a while, like there are sort of irreducible things that cannot happen with that experience. You can't just sort of reduce that into quantifiable data and statistics. So Wendell Berry, just as a person, like he has written dozens of books, right? I would probably say at least 50. I'm not entirely certain, but probably that many. And he brings up these concerns a lot, right? Because his background is in academia, and his whole feeling on academia, it's been a little bit tainted. He left academia a while ago because he was very concerned with this idea of like pushing research forward, more and more research, more and more research, more and more research. And his thing is like, how is this adding to things that I care about? And some of the things he cares about are sort of, like, he lives in like small town Kentucky now. It's like he cares about his neighbors and his community and the sense of belonging and a good relationship with his family and his wife. And he's like, these are things that I care about, taking care of the land, right? He owns a farm, right? These sorts of things. And so he has all these questions about the progression of technology, the progression of science, and the whole attitude of like, well, just because we can make a faster, more efficient iPhone, like, do we really need to, right? Like, how does that add to his quality of life, right? So some of the things, he would probably question with regard to like iPhone and like social networking and Twitter and Facebook and all that kind of stuff, right? This idea of like a sense of belonging. It's like we have the ability to create these things to connect with more people statistically. Like you can have 500, 1,000 Facebook friends, that more people you're connected with, right? But we also recognize that there's this sort of like loneliness epidemic going on in the world. Like more and more people report that they have fewer and fewer friends or family members that they can rely on, right? And so we need to make sure that we are discussing this through some sort of qualitative means, as opposed to just saying, is the goal of life to collect more and more Facebook friends, right? Or is the goal of life to have no Facebook friends, but 10 people who are really, really close to you in your community and give you a sense of belonging and relationship long term for, the 100 years you might be on this planet, all right? So a couple quick items, Wendell Berry, he's not against science, right? There are some people who, are very critical of Berry and, call him a Luddite, for instance, say that he's a person who would be against modern medicine. I don't read him as such, right? What I do find is that he is merely against what has sometimes been deemed called the tyranny of scientific materialism, right? So this idea that life can only progress if we sort of create more and more data. Like life will only get better when the iPhone 15 comes out or the iPhone 20 comes out. Like we have to put out a new iPhone every year. We have to make more and more social networks. And it's like, like at some point you're like, I have, Twitter and Facebook and Instagram. It's like, how many more networks do I need, right, to connect with people? At some point, it's like maybe I should just have some friends over on a Friday night, every week, and we, drink wine and eat off a charcuterie board and like enjoy, some nice music together. Like that would probably give me a greater sense of belonging and purpose than just sort of like the constant accumulation of numbers, right? So he's against, yeah, the tyranny of scientific materialism, this idea that we should go around and reduce everything to its utilitarian purpose of being super efficient all the time. And instead we should be focusing on, how do these things make us feel? Do they make us feel more complete? If I upgrade from, I have an iPhone 5, if I upgrade from an iPhone 5 to, I think we're on like the 12, like, will I feel uh, a more holistic sense of belonging in the world? Will that iPhone 12 somehow make me feel more connected to the world around me? All right. So these are questions that Barry brings up. And again, this is through a qualitative means. All right. He says we need to make sure that as science progresses, that we're also interviewing people and talking to people with regard to what do you value and are these things that you are adding to your life because they are more efficient, because science has created the newest, next cool thing. Um, are they adding value to what you are saying is valuable? Excuse me. So a couple quick items on just Wendell Berry's biography. He taught at New York University as well as University of Kentucky. And he's written extensively on his teaching experiences, right? However, in 1977, he actually resigned his position at the University of Kentucky, and he was only 43 years old. Currently, he's in his late 80s. He's still around. He's still writing. Um, and what he did was he resigned from his university position for two reasons. Well, two reasons that have been documented. I'm sure there's a lot of other things. But he talks about how he didn't like the corporate influence in education, and this is 1970s. So things like, university systems that get bigger and bigger and bigger, right? Like you have nicer residence halls, and you have like super cool cafeterias, and you have the newest, latest technology available in the library. That has to be paid somehow, right? And usually how it's paid for is some big corporation gives the school a lot of money, they get new computers, they get a new sports arena, but then that corporation gets to like post their name on the arena or post it on the residence hall or like, this residence hall is sponsored by, Wells Fargo. There was a article I read this weekend about Michigan State basketball. I think I think this might be correct. You can look it up, but I think the new like Michigan State basketball like logo or PR stunt is they now have to say like Michigan State athletics brought to you by I think it was Rocket Mortgage. But either way, it's like you see how this sort of corporate influence in education. Then you get to the question of like, what is education for? Are we supposed to go there? Like, is it worth having a new computer lab? If that, how does that make our educational experience better with regard to what it is we're actually looking for in an educational experience? Having a new computer lab doesn't help me to better read Dostoevsky, right? It doesn't help me to better understand Shakespeare. It doesn't help me to better write a paper on Milton, all right? So Wendell Berry starts asking these questions of, is the purpose just sort of like infinite progress into ultimate efficiency, which is what science does. Like science, as far as like scientific discoveries for our everyday life, is about understanding our life to make it more and more and more efficient. And Wendell Berry's like, maybe like, what's the purpose of making it efficient? And what efficiency does for us, is it actually what we want? All right. Um, I'll talk about this picture here in a moment here. All right. He also thinks that there was too much emphasis on research, like this endless idea of like publish or perish is what it's called in the university setting, and not enough emphasis on teaching and grading. So he was a teacher who would, he's an English teacher who was grading students' papers, and he recalls this conversation he had with one of his colleagues, and his colleagues just said like, if you spend less time grading these students' papers, you can spend more time researching and writing. Um, and Wendell Berry's like, but like my job is to grade papers. My job is to help students learn how to construct clear sentences so that they have clear thoughts and they know how to express themselves. And so there's this tension between should I be spending a whole lot of time researching or, is university for teaching people? Like, should I be spending more time teaching students? What's the purpose of me writing more and more and more papers if I'm not actually focusing on the 50 to 100 students I have every semester to make them better writers and clearer thinkers and the rest of it, right? Um, in 2009, so about 12 years ago now, all of his papers, right? So he's a pretty important person in the state of Kentucky. All of his papers, he removed them all from the University of Kentucky because of their connections with the coal industry. He's very against what he calls what is known as mountaintop removal, which is to get coal, we used to dig holes under mountains and then we'd go in and we'd take them out. That's very dangerous because you'd have collapses and people die in these collapses, right? So now what they do is this process called mountaintop removal. So they go in from the top and they just like basically like here's a mountain and they just keep cutting it down, cutting it down, cutting it down, going from the top. He was, obviously that's going to you're going to completely erode a mountain that way, right? It ruins the landscape. But again, because of the sort of like energy industry has a lot of money. They can give it to the University of Kentucky. The University of Kentucky, they want a new basketball arena. They want more residence halls. Wendell Berry was like, there shouldn't be corporate influence in an education setting. Like, what is education for? And then he's also, this concern of like, if we have endless energy, but it's at the cost of like removing mountains, like rearranging our landscape into these sort of like ugly, desolate places where we can't enjoy nature anymore. He does ask this question like, why? Like, what's it for? Like, should a life be about experiencing nature and experiencing beauty, or should it be about just like using science to create the ultimate to create ultimate efficiency as far as like powering our smartphones and heating our homes and putting gas into our cars, right? Um, so again, he's not against science. I'm not against science. Like I'm happy that somebody is out there in the petroleum industry, making it so that I can put gas in my truck, right? But this sort of like constant, every year, do you have to update your iPhone every year? Does updating your iPhone actually get you closer to the values that you have in your life? And if you value things like, community belonging, etc., there might be other ways to do that than just sort of like constantly, again, genuflecting at the altar of science to say like science will save us. And Wendell Berry steps back and says, maybe science won't save us. Science is good, it has its place, but there are these qualitative things in our life that we have to make sure we focus on, because if we continue to genuflect and say science will save us, we lose sight of things like community, belonging, friendships, the mysteries of religion and art and all this other kind of stuff, right? Like you get value out of things beyond just waiting for the next piece of technology to come out to feel as if your life is now complete. All right, so finally, all right, Barry asked these following questions, okay? And others do too. So we have to ask these questions like, what is education for, right? Like, why are you in school? Like, what's this whole exercise about? And if it is just like to create, for me to be more efficient in order to get a job, Wendell Berry and other traditional education individuals, I'd probably include myself in this, would say like that shouldn't be the ultimate goal of education, right? Education shouldn't be about just like position yourself to have a good job in a story. It should be about sort of exploring the broad range of human experience and human discoveries to feel as if you can sort of find more of a purpose in your own life. When you have an understanding of like the world cultural around you, when you have understanding of like good books and good artwork, you move through the world and you have a better quality and you have a better quality of life. You have a better, sort of qualitative understanding of, you know, the beauty, right? So here's a quick painting right here. This is one of my favorite paintings. I go over this in some of my other classes. It's called Monkey in the Studio, and it's supposed depict like a freshman college student coming in with this sort of what's sometimes known as like monkey mind in like Eastern philosophy, meditation circles, etc. Right, where it's like you're kind of all over the place. Like I don't know what I want my major to be. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with myself. Every 5 seconds, like you're losing focus and you're jumping to one experience to the next. But this Monkey in the Studio painting, it's one of my favorites. It's actually housed in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. You can see it. It's only about an 8 by 10. It's relatively small. All right. But we have like a college student here, and they are playing around with a musical instrument. Here's some sheet music. They have some philosophers up here. They're painting a little bit. It's supposed to represent like what's a liberal arts education. It's like you're not going to be a world famous musician, but it's like you should know a little bit about music. You're not going to be this like astute philosopher for the rest of your life, but you should know a little bit about philosophy. You should know a little bit about art. You should take a couple mathematics classes. Like you should take a little bit of everything. Now, when you move through the world, you have a better sense of sort of like how it all fits together. All right. Again, so what is education for? What is college for, et cetera, right? What should you be doing while you're here? What you should be doing is sort of like exploring everything, right? And figuring out what your own values are. What type of life do you want to live with regard to when you go home at the end of your workday every day? Like, how do you feel about your job? And if it is a question of like, I just want to accumulate more and more and more money, like infinite progress until I die one day, Wendell Berry and others would be concerned, right? Because if you exhaust yourself at a 12-hour workday every day, eventually it's like you're gonna have to do that for 40 years, and then you look back and you're like, was there something else I could have been doing in that 40 years? Is it just about the accumulation of sort of like numbers and statistics, or are there other things that I value, right? So if I can work a little bit harder and make $5,000 more a year, does that come at the expense of me missing my kids' baseball games on the weekend? Does that come at the expense of me missing a date night with my spouse? Does that come at the expense of all these other sort of qualitative things that make up your life? All right. And so there's a tension there, right? Again, science is good, progress is good, having a good job, making a good paycheck, all these things are good. But we can't sort of genuflect at the altar of infinite progress to the point where we're missing out on some of the qualitative reasons as to why it is we care to make that much money or like have that much efficiency, right? If you have the newest iPhone, it's like, how can I use this in a way to make sure that I'm adding value to those things that I find valuable, all right? How can I make sure that I'm using this to connect with my loved ones and the rest of it? All right. The last thing that I want you to do, so we're kind of ending class short here today, is I want you to watch this documentary called Why Beauty Matters. It's put together by the BBC, it's over in Britain, and it's out of some of the writings of a philosopher who died last year, January of 2020, I believe is when he died. His name's Roger Scruton, actually technically Sir Roger Scruton, I guess he was knighted. But he wrote a lot on this idea of like beauty and architecture in the world around us. So they took some of his writings, the BBC did, and they worked with him to make this documentary. And I'll put the link down below. It's not on YouTube; it's on a different video streaming channel, but it's free. I think you could search it on YouTube as well. I think there's probably a YouTube link for it. But he also sort of brings up these concerns about sort of utilitarianism, this idea of just like making things efficiently as possible. So for instance, like something like architecture, the cheapest way to create architecture is like make a rectangular building with all the rooms exactly the same, so it's very symmetrical. You have a brick exterior, right? Like you've seen these like ugly, ugly, ugly buildings. It's like you take a Lego, like the shape of a Lego, and you plop it in the middle of a park, and then you treat it like a filing cabinet. You just shove people in the filing cabinet, right? And what Scruton points out is like this is like a very ugly way to live. It's very, very efficient because it's cheap, right? The materials are cheap, The design is cheap because everything is very symmetrical. You don't have to waste a lot of money with details and flourishes and just like different pitches of a roof, right? Like these things start to cost money. Instead, just like four walls and some windows and shove people in there and it all looks the same. Scrooge says like, yeah, you could do that. That's efficient, but like nobody wants to live in that building. Nobody wants to live in that neighborhood. So even though it's efficient for our pocketbooks, he says like there's something about there's something about beauty in our life, this qualitative experience of surrounding yourself with beautiful things, right? Like, so he talks about like making beautiful buildings. Him or somebody else has sort of coined the term they call like people-size cities. You want people-size buildings. You don't want these giant skyscrapers. It's like you want things that are that people can live in, like a community. Where you want to live in an area where there's no buildings that are taller than about 4 or 5 stories that you could actually walk up and sort of feel a connection with your neighborhood. So watch this documentary. He also talks about things like like gardening. Like why do we garden? Like that's a weird thing to do to spend your money on, but people do it because they want to create this sort of like quality sense of beauty in their lives, right? So there's all these little things that we do that make absolutely no sense with regard to sort of like ultimate efficiency. But we do these little flourishes in our life to sort of make our life a little bit more beautiful. And then Scruton, along with Barry, in their writing, sort of point out, what is life for? What should college be about? What are the quality things that we pursue? What are our values that we have that can't be solved or even really deduced or recognized by just like this pure scientific method of reducing everything into data points, right? So there is a sort of like mystery of life that we have that we can start to discover in the qualitative method of going out there and talking to people about what's important to you, what are your values. You can't figure that out on a Likert scale. All right, so watch this video. I hope it's useful to you, not just for this class, but just useful in your own life, as far as sort of making sure how can you make your own surroundings a bit more beautiful, because those are the surroundings you have to live in. All right, so you don't want to live in something that you feel no connection to. You do want to live a life where you feel connected to that community around you. All right, and that connection is not going to be found in constantly chasing after the next cool iPhone, right? There are these deeper things that we have in us that we want to go after, that can maybe only really be discussed through a qualitative means. All right, watch that video.